On the night of November 20th, 1944, in a dark brewery on the edge of Metz, an American sergeant stepped through dust, broken glass, and the sour smell of spilled beer, hunting the last German holdouts room by room. The battle outside had not fully died. Gunfire still cracked in the distance. Somewhere above him, plaster drifted from the ceiling with every concussion. Then, in the corner, he saw a man crouched in the shadows, not a frightened teenage conscript, not a wounded private, a well-dressed officer with polished authority still clinging to him like a second uniform. He was SS, captured alive. And when the American weapon came up, the German did not reach for glory. He reached for survival. By dawn, that prisoner was standing before General George S. Patton. He was not just another German officer. He was one of the men who had worn the black badge of terror and expected the world to flinch. But now the Reich was bending, Metz was breaking, and he was in the hands of the one Allied commander the Germans spoke about with a mix of hatred and unease. Then came the request, not shouted, not dramatic, almost colder than that. He wanted mercy in the form war sometimes allowed, recognition, dignity, treatment as a soldier. What Patton did next was not the kind of answer Hollywood usually writes. It was harder, sharper, and it revealed in a single encounter exactly how Patton saw the difference between a fighting enemy and a viper in uniform. By the time that SS officer was taken away, everybody in the room understood something terrifying. Patton was perfectly capable of fury, but what made him dangerous was what he chose to do with it. George S. Patton loved war in the way only a man obsessed with speed, steel, and destiny could love it. He loved movement, surprise, attack, momentum. He believed hesitation killed armies and mercy, when badly timed, killed nations. His soldiers cursed him, admired him, feared him, and followed him. His enemies studied him the way sailors study storms. By late 1944, Patton's Third Army had already become something close to a machine of appetite. It did not simply advance, it lunged. It tore across France with an energy that made German planners keep glancing at maps in disbelief. When gasoline ran short, Patton raged. When roads jammed, Patton maneuvered. When higher headquarters slowed him, Patton simmered like an engine forced into idle. He wanted Germany cracked open before winter locked everything in place. But Metz would not yield easily. That was the first layer of this story, and it mattered because mercy means one thing in a clean surrender, and something very different after a city has fought like a cornered animal. Metz was not just a dot on a map. It was a fortress city, historically important, ringed by old forts, and defended with the kind of stubbornness that bleeds an attacker dry one block at a time. The Germans had turned every position into a thorn. American units clawed forward through cold rain, mud, and fire. Men who had expected a fast thrust east found themselves bogged down in brutal, intimate combat. Patton hated that kind of delay because he understood the deeper danger. A stalled army does not merely lose time, it loses rhythm. And Patton believed rhythm in war was almost everything. So when Metz finally began to crack in November, when the Americans started closing their grip and hunting the last defenders through cellars, warehouses, courtyards, and breweries, the city became a place where rank disappeared quickly. A major could die like a private. A general could hide in dust. And that was exactly what happened. The SS officer found in that brewery was no ordinary captive. He was Anton Dunkern, a senior SS and police leader in the region, a man shaped by the Nazi state and entrusted with power that went far beyond ordinary soldiering. He had the aura of a system behind him, the bureaucratic cruelty, the authority, the presumption that men like him would always command and others would always obey. He belonged to the side of the German war machine Patton despised most. That distinction is crucial if you want to understand what happened next. Patton could admire courage in an enemy. He had no problem saying that many German soldiers were brave professionals. He respected aggression, competence, and battlefield skill even in men trying to kill Americans. But the SS was something else to him, not merely military, political, fanatical, tainted. He saw ordinary German soldiers as opponents in war. He saw the SS as something closer to poison introduced into war. And now one of those men had been dragged out of hiding and brought before him alive. Before Patton even spoke, the scene already contained everything he hated. A senior Nazi who had not died at his post. A high-ranking officer who, when found, had not gone down shooting, had not blown himself up. I had not chosen the heroic death his regime endlessly preached. He had been cornered, captured by an American sergeant, and suddenly the grand language of sacrifice gave way to the practical language of captivity. That offended Patton on a level deeper than strategy, because Patton, for all his aggression, had a savage code. He believed if a man claimed to be a warrior, then he should accept a warrior's risks. If a Nazi leader demanded fanatical resistance from others, then he had no business becoming delicate when the noose tightened around his own neck. Hypocrisy, more than fear, lit Patton's temper. The SS general's request did not come as a sobbing plea on bent knees. That would have been too theatrical, and real war is often colder than theater. His appeal was dressed in the language of soldierly rights, and he insisted that because he had fought American troops and had been captured by American forces, he should be considered an American prisoner of war and treated accordingly. On the surface, it sounded formal, legal, even calm, but Patton heard the subtext immediately. Save me from what comes next. Protect me from the consequences tied to the uniform I chose. Let the rules shield me now. That was the mercy being asked for. And Patton answered in a way that stunned the room. Even though he spoke German fluently, he refused to address the prisoner directly in German. That choice was not accidental. It was psychological warfare wrapped in contempt. Patton would use an interpreter. He would not grant the SS officer the honor of direct conversation. He would not meet him on equal terms. 8. He would not allow the prisoner the dignity of civilized exchange between professionals. That denial told everyone present exactly how Patton classified the man before him, not as a worthy enemy, as something lower. Then Patton started cutting. He said he had captured many German generals, and this was the first one who had been wholly untrue to everything, because he had been not only a Nazi, but false even to Nazi standards by surrendering. It was a brutal line because it attacked the prisoner from every direction at once. Patton was saying, "You are not only my enemy, you have failed your own myth. You preached fanaticism and did not live it. You demanded loyalty and now seek protection. You spent your career inside a creed of hardness, and at the decisive moment, you chose survival." The SS general tried to defend himself. What he said, he had received orders, that he had been unable to reach his weapons, that there was no possibility to continue fighting. It was the language of circumstances, constraint, necessity, a narrowing tunnel of excuses. Patton exploded through it. He is a liar. That response mattered because Patton was not really arguing over the details of one room in one brewery. He was rejecting the entire structure of selective innocence that so many Nazi officials would later try to build around themselves. I had orders. I had no choice. I did what the situation required. I acted honorably under impossible conditions. Those phrases would become a shield for a whole defeated system. Patton could hear the shield being raised before the war was even over, and he struck it with contempt. The prisoner persisted. If he had fought as a soldier and been captured by Americans, then surely he should be treated as a soldier, as a prisoner of the American forces. That was the request for mercy in its most stripped-down form. Not compassion, not forgiveness. Protection through classification, recognition through law. At this point, a lesser man might have answered with rage and theatrics. Another commander might have tried to humiliate the captive through screaming or cheap cruelty. Patton did something colder. He threatened the prisoner with transfer to the French. That threat was not random. In occupied Europe, especially in places brutalized by German security forces, being handed to local or allied authorities carried a terrible implication. The SS knew how hated they were. They knew what had been done in villages, prisons, police cells, resistance networks, and occupied towns. They knew memory was waiting for them. So when Patton suggested turning him over, he was pressing on the one fear deeper than battlefield defeat, reckoning. The SS officer pushed back, almost desperately. He insisted again that he had been captured by Americans, not French forces. He was trying to anchor himself to the one category that might still preserve his life and status. He wanted the war to remain abstract, regulated, manageable. He wanted to stand inside the Geneva box and keep the world outside. Patton refused him that comfort. "When I am dealing with vipers," he said, "I do not have to be bothered by any foolish ideas any more than he has been." That line may be the heart of the entire story, because in Patton's mind, the SS officer was not just another enemy asking for fair procedure. He was a representative of a movement that had itself shredded procedure whenever it chose. The request for mercy was real, but to Patton it came coated in poison. It was a viper asking to be handled like a hound. And yet, this is where the story becomes more interesting than legend. Patton did not shoot him. He did not order him taken outside and killed. He did not turn the room into a blood-soaked scene of revenge. He did something far more revealing. He kept the man alive, under guard, under pressure, and under the shadow of further investigation. He stripped him of status, denied him honor, threatened him with consequences, and made clear that his fate would not be decided by the prisoner's preferred definitions. But Patton still moved within the machinery of custody. Fury was present, execution was not. That difference matters because it tells us what Patton actually did after an SS officer asked for mercy. He refused sentimental mercy, refused equal honor, refused easy absolution, but did not collapse into lawless vengeance. He answered the plea with contempt and process, with pressure and exposure, with the promise that being alive did not mean being safe. That is a much darker and much more historically revealing response than the simple fantasy of immediate retaliation. To understand why, you have to understand the kind of command Patton believed he was exercising. Patton wanted to be feared, yes, but not as a random butcher. He wanted to be feared as the commander of a victorious civilization that hit hard and moved fast, and still believed, at least in theory, that war had rules. That made him a walking contradiction. He cursed like a brawler, threatened like a medieval captain, performed like a gladiator, and yet he also understood the political value of discipline. He knew armies did not just fight, they testified. Every prisoner taken, every order given, every action in the rear areas would become part of the record of what kind of force the Third Army really was, and Patton cared deeply about that record, even when his language made him sound like he did not. That does not mean Patton was gentle. He was not. It does not mean he was morally tidy. He absolutely was not. He could be impulsive, vain, cruel in speech, and astonishingly insensitive. He carried prejudices and blind spots that stain any clean, heroic portrait. But one reason he remains compelling is that he was never simple. So he could talk like a savage and still understand restraint as a weapon. He could humiliate a prisoner and still preserve the structure that kept soldiers from becoming a mob. That was the edge he walked in moments like this. The room where the interrogation unfolded was not just a place where one SS officer trembled under scrutiny. It was a theater of definitions. What is a soldier? What is a criminal? What does surrender erase? What does it not erase? Does a uniform transform a man's past? Can battlefield capture wash away the political filth attached to a career in terror? The SS officer wanted one answer. Patton gave another. You also acted as a policeman, Patton told him, a low type of police. There it was. The prisoner wanted to be seen narrowly, as a military man captured in war. Patton broadened the frame. No, he was saying. You do not get to enter this room carrying only the cleanest part of your resume. You are bringing your whole system with you, your police power, your party service, your role in a machinery of intimidation. You cannot peel those off now that they are inconvenient. The SS general insisted he had acted honorably and humanely. Patton answered that no Nazi policeman could act in an honorable manner. Again, the point was not merely insult, it was classification. Patton was refusing the prisoner's self-description, refusing the right of a Nazi official to narrate himself into decency. The prisoner said no one would be able to testify that he had done anything against the rules of humanity. That sentence hangs in the air in a different way when we hear it now. Because history is full of men who thought the absence of witnesses was the same thing as innocence. Patton was not persuaded. He said special investigators could question the prisoner and do things he himself could not do. Then, just before sending him away, he delivered one more chilling touch. Tell him, Patton said, that those bayonets on the guards' guns are very sharp. That line was pure Patton theater. Menace, domination, control. Not an order to kill, not a joke. A deliberate reminder that the prisoner was alive by American choice, not by his own entitlement. Whatever category he claimed, whatever legal shield he invoked, he stood inside a perimeter defined by men with weapons and by the will of the commander facing him. So what happened after the request for mercy? Patton denied the SS officer the dignity he wanted. He refused to speak to him directly in German. He called him a liar. He mocked the gap between Nazi rhetoric and personal conduct. He threatened to hand him over. He redefined him not as an honorable soldier, but as a political predator. He kept him alive for interrogation rather than granting him martyrdom. And in doing all of that, he turned mercy itself into a trap. The prisoner asked for protection. Patton gave him survival without honor. That was worse in some ways than a bullet, because it meant living long enough to be examined, living long enough to be named, living long enough to watch the Nazi myth stripped off in public. This is where many people misunderstand Patton. They imagine his hatred worked only in one direction, toward destruction. But Patton also understood the strategic use of humiliation. So death can end a story too quickly. Captivity can force it open. A dead SS commander becomes a rumor. A living one becomes evidence. That instinct would become even more haunting as the war moved into its final phase. At Metz in late 1944, the full scale of the concentration camp system had not yet been burned into American consciousness the way it would be in the spring of 1945. The Allies knew plenty already about Nazi brutality, massacres, reprisals, deportations, slave labor, anti-Jewish persecution. But knowledge in war often arrives in layers. Intelligence reports say one thing, a battlefield says another. A liberated camp says something else entirely. There is a difference between hearing and smelling, between reading and seeing, between knowing intellectually and standing in front of stacked corpses. The Patton's confrontation with the SS general at Metz happened before that last layer of horror hit him in person, and yet, even then, he already sensed the category the SS belonged to. That matters because it means his response in the interrogation room was not a spontaneous tantrum, it was rooted in a worldview. Patton could separate the German soldier from the Nazi functionary, and he did it sharply. He might fight both, he might kill both, but he did not grant them the same moral standing. That distinction also helps explain the deeper coldness of his answer to the mercy request. Patton was not saying that rules did not exist. He was saying that the prisoner had no right to lecture him about rules while wearing the insignia of a regime that had treated rules like disposable paper whenever power demanded it. And Patton would decide what lawful custody looked like. The captive would not. After the interrogation, the prisoner was removed under guard. The spectacle was over, but its effect lingered. Men in the room had seen how Patton handled an enemy who expected technical protection after building his life inside ideological violence. They had seen that Patton's first instinct was not reconciliation, it was hierarchy. He would define the encounter. He would decide how much dignity remained available, and he would make sure the prisoner understood that survival was not the same as vindication. For Patton's own soldiers, scenes like this fed the legend. To them, Patton was not just a distant commander moving divisions on a map. He could appear abruptly, turn an interrogation into an execution chamber of words, and leave everyone with the feeling that some ancient wrath had walked through the room in polished boots. That was part of why men remembered him so vividly. He did not merely issue orders, he created atmosphere. He made power feel theatrical, immediate, personal. The Germans noticed that too. By 1944, Patton had become a psychological fact on both sides of the front. German commanders often judged him aggressive, dangerous, and unpredictable in exactly the ways that frightened them most. Allied soldiers, even those who rolled their eyes at his ego, knew he radiated attack. When his headquarters appeared somewhere, it felt like movement was about to begin. When he arrived near a line, the line usually shifted forward. That reputation intensified every personal encounter. So when an SS general asked for mercy from Patton's system, he was not asking an anonymous bureaucracy, he was asking the most feared face of American armored momentum in Europe, and Patton made sure the answer would not be forgettable. There is another layer here, one even darker than the interrogation itself. Patton despised cowardice, but what he despised even more was false hardness. He hated men who could preach sacrifice to others and then become procedural when their own skin was at stake. The SS officer had belonged to a movement that glorified pitilessness, demanded obedience, and saturated Europe with fear. To hear one of its senior figures suddenly speak the language of soldierly fairness was, to Patton, nauseating. That is why he attacked not only the man's conduct but his identity. If he wanted to be a good Nazi, Patton said, he could have died then and there. It is a horrifying line if you think about it long enough. Patton was not praising Nazism. He was using the regime's own warped code as a weapon against one of its servants. You built your power on fanaticism, he was saying. Then why are you here alive bargaining? Why are you not dead by the myth you imposed on others? That rhetorical move did two things at once. It humiliated the prisoner personally, and it exposed the bankruptcy of the entire ideology. Once the Reich's senior men were frightened, captured, and searching for legal categories, the glamour of total commitment looked very small indeed. In that sense, Patton was performing a kind of ideological dissection long before post-war courtrooms would do it more formally. But history refused to leave this as merely an interrogation story, because in April 1945, though Patton's army reached places that made the word mercy feel almost obscene. Ohrdruf was the first concentration camp liberated by American forces, a subcamp of the Buchenwald system. When Patton visited with Eisenhower and Bradley, he found evidence of starvation, torture, murder, bodies scattered and burned, a pyre of charred remains, the kind of scenes that hit even veteran commanders like a physical blow. Patton, who had seen battle's gore and lived among its brutal arithmetic, vomited from the sight and smell. In one shed, emaciated corpses had been piled and sprinkled with lime. Survivors demonstrated methods of torture used by guards. The camp was proof, not rumor. That spring revelation throws a hard backward light on the Metz interrogation, because the SS officer there had asked, in effect, to be treated as a soldier among soldiers. By April 1945, Patton had looked into a world where the men wearing Nazi authority had overseen something far beyond ordinary war. The gap between a Wehrmacht officer in a defensive line and a system of camps, police power, and exterminatory brutality was no longer theoretical. It was visible, stinking, undeniable. After Ohrdruf and later Buchenwald, Patton did something revealing again. He did not hide the horror from sight. He wanted it shown. German civilians were forced to see camps and bury the dead. Journalists and dignitaries were encouraged to witness. The crimes were not to vanish into battlefield rumor. They were to be dragged into daylight. That impulse connects directly back to what he did with the captured SS officer: expose, interrogate, strip away the disguise. Do not let the perpetrators define themselves. Do not let them disappear into technicalities. In other words, the answer Patton gave to the request for mercy in late 1944 was part of a broader instinct that became even more pronounced in 1945. The guilty should not control the narrative of their own conduct. This is important because it keeps us from flattening Patton into a cartoon. The easy version of the story would be that Patton was so furious at the SS that he simply wanted them shot. But the more disturbing truth is that he often wanted something more strategically useful. He wanted them captured, identified, and denied the comforting myths they tried to wrap around themselves. He wanted them seen. There is a special kind of dread in that, because immediate death can look like rage, prolonged exposure looks like judgment. And Patton, for all his violence, understood judgment, not always evenly, not always fairly, not always with the moral consistency later generations might wish for, but he understood its power. He knew war ends, and then questions begin. Who ordered what? Who looked away? Who called himself a soldier while acting as something else? Who hid behind rank? Who hid behind procedure? Who begged the law to save him after helping build a system that trampled law flat? That is the larger echo inside this encounter. The captured SS officer was really asking for a narrow answer to a narrow problem. Patton answered with a larger verdict. You do not get to choose the frame anymore. You are in our hands now, and we will decide what part of your story counts. There is something almost Roman about that, which fits Patton more than he would have admitted aloud. He thought in terms of destiny, precedent, exemplars, campaigns that echoed older wars. He read military history obsessively. He talked about battle like a man who believed ghosts were always watching. So when a senior enemy fell into his power, the encounter became more than administrative. It became ceremonial in the old sense. Not polite ceremony, ritualized domination. Patton staged mastery the way some commanders staged calm. He needed the prisoner to feel the imbalance completely. That is why the interpreter mattered. That is why the threat of handover mattered. That is why the sharp bayonets mattered. Each element removed one more illusion. The SS man was not standing before a colleague. He was standing before the victorious force that now owned the next page of his life. And yet, again, Patton stopped short of lawless revenge. That line deserves emphasis because it is precisely what makes the story powerful. A lesser legend would satisfy itself with simple blood. Patton's actual response was more disciplined, more humiliating, and more consequential. He understood that the strongest answer to a man begging for the protections of civilization was not to abandon civilization immediately. It was to show that those protections existed because his side, not the prisoners, still had the power and confidence to enforce them. That is why the interrogation remains so striking. Patton was furious enough to terrify the man, contemptuous enough to deny him respect, threatening enough to make his future look black, yet controlled enough to keep him within custody. Power without restraint becomes chaos. Restraint without power becomes weakness. Patton wanted the prisoner to feel both at once, and he did. What did the SS officer think as he was let out? We can only imagine. But the possibilities are not hard to see. He had likely expected anger. Perhaps he expected rough treatment. Perhaps he even expected physical violence. What he got instead was something psychologically worse. He was told in unmistakable terms that the identity he wanted recognized had been rejected by the commander who now held his fate. He would live, yes, but he would live in a category Patton considered contaminated. For men of rank, humiliation can wound deeper than fear, especially men from authoritarian systems built on prestige, obedience, and display. The SS was a hierarchy of symbols as much as force, uniform, title, bearing, ritual. Patton smashed those symbols in minutes. He reduced the prisoner from an embodiment of Nazi authority to a defensive voice pleading over classifications. That collapse of status is one reason such encounters travel so far in memory. Armies love stories where the mighty are stripped. History loves them even more. But Patton's role in the story is larger than that single room. He was a commander operating at the hinge point between combat and reckoning. By late 1944 and early 1945, the Allies were not simply defeating German formations. They were approaching the inner architecture of the regime itself. Secret police power, party administrators, camp systems, collaborators, local functionaries. Men who had spent years terrifying occupied populations suddenly found themselves trying to speak the language of legal reciprocity. So Patton saw the performance instantly, and because he saw it instantly, his answer still feels cinematic 80 years later. Not because it was kind, because it was unsparing. He did not grant the SS officer the emotional shape he wanted. No dramatic forgiveness, no grand speech about American decency, no handshake between professionals. Patton refused the prisoner's preferred script and wrote another one on the spot. That is exactly the sort of moment that stays viral in the imagination. A powerful man asked for mercy, and instead of answering the way anyone expects, he answered in a manner both harsher and more controlled. That unpredictability is part of Patton's enduring grip on audiences. He is never boring because he rarely lands in the obvious place. He could be vulgar but calculating, theatrical but exact. Savage in language yet strangely procedural in action. He turned contradictions into force. He made people lean in because they could never be sure whether the next thing out of his mouth would be brilliant, appalling, or unforgettable. Often it was all three. There is also the matter of leadership by signal. Patton knew his own officers, and enlisted men watched him constantly for cues, especially in gray zones. How do we think about these prisoners? Are they honorable enemies? Fanatics? Criminals? Politicals? Professionals? Patton's handling of the SS officer sent a message down the chain. German soldiers might earn soldierly respect. The SS should expect none. That distinction was morally imperfect in application, as all wartime distinctions tend to be, but as a leadership signal it was clear. It also helped preserve discipline in a paradoxical way. By verbalizing contempt at the top, Patton relieved some of the pressure building in men below. Soldiers who saw what the Nazis had done, or who fought SS units known for fanatic resistance and atrocities, could easily slide toward indiscriminate revenge. A commander who openly named the SS as vile while still keeping prisoners in custody created a channel between rage and order. Hate them, yes, but process them. That may not sound noble. It sounds like war, because it is war, and war, especially at the end, is full of moments where the difference between justice and vengeance becomes thin enough to cut. Patton lived on that thinness. His own flaws make this story more complicated, not less. He was capable of callous judgments. He could be contemptuous in ways history rightly criticizes. His post-war comments and attitudes towards some groups remain deeply troubling. He was not a saint policing evil from a place of pure moral clarity. He was a violent, brilliant, deeply imperfect commander confronting a regime whose crimes often outstripped imagination. That is precisely why the scene works. Two hard worlds collided in that room, and one of them suddenly found itself stripped of all protection except the protection it had once mocked. The SS officer asked for mercy. Patton answered with asymmetry. And then history kept proving Patton's instinct that these were not ordinary men in ordinary uniforms. After the camps were opened, after the pyres, the skeletal survivors, the lime, the stench, the dead stacked in sheds and scattered on the ground, and the entire moral atmosphere of the war thickened, it was no longer enough to win. The Allies had to witness, they had to document, they had to force the world to see what the Nazi state had hidden behind euphemism and barbed wire. Patton participated in that exposure, sometimes brutally. He supported making German civilians confront the evidence. He knew denial would come. He wanted facts standing in its path. That, too, is part of what he did after hearing an SS man ask for mercy. He helped create a world where pleading would no longer be enough. A world where identity, role, and responsibility would be examined against bodies in the earth. A world where "treat me as a soldier" could be answered with "then explain the police, the camps, the fear, the disappeared." Once you understand that, the title's answer becomes sharper. And what Patton did was not simply refuse. He redefined the terms. He treated mercy not as a gift the prisoner could demand, but as a boundary the victor could control. The SS officer would not be torn apart on the spot, but neither would he be allowed to float into clean soldierly legitimacy. Patton's answer trapped him between survival and disgrace, and that is why the scene feels so modern, even now, because we still live among versions of that question. What do powerful men deserve once their systems collapse? Can they hide inside procedure? Can they relabel themselves? Does being captured in a conventional battle erase what they helped build outside it? When they ask for rights, are they invoking principles they honored or merely principles they now need? Patton's answer was ugly, unsentimental, and memorable. No. You do not get to cleanse yourself on contact. No. You do not get to define this encounter. No. Survival is not innocence. The prisoner's own words reveal the desperation beneath the composure. I fought American troops. I was captured by American forces. Therefore, I am a prisoner of war of the American forces. It is almost mathematical, a syllogism. If A and B, then C. But Patton smashed the equation by adding the variable the prisoner wanted removed, who you are. Not just what happened tonight, who you are. That is the whole story in one move. And once that move is made, every line Patton speaks after it falls into place. The liar accusation, the refusal to speak German, the viper line, the low police line, the threat of transfer, the sharp bayonets. Each one says the same thing differently. Your preferred identity has been denied. Some stories about Patton survive because they flatter his legend. This one survives because it complicates it. He is not a clean avenger. He is not a merciful statesman. He is something harder to categorize. A commander who understood that an enemy asking for lawful treatment could be answered lawfully while still being made to feel morally naked. That is a terrifying talent. It is also a political one, because wars are not won only by destroying armies. They are won by defining meanings afterward. What was this enemy? What did he represent? How do we talk about him once the shooting stops? If captured SS leaders could slip comfortably into the generic category of soldier, then half the truth of Nazism could blur away in the smoke of normal war. Patton refused that blur. He insisted on the stain. So even his insults were acts of classification, and perhaps that is why the moment still lands with such force. We are used to stories where mercy is either granted nobly or denied savagely. Patton chose a third path. He denied the emotional comfort of mercy while preserving the formal structure of custody. He kept the man alive, but not intact. He let him remain a prisoner, but not merely a prisoner. He made him carry the weight of the uniform he wanted reduced to technicality. That is colder than rage. It is memory applied in advance. Years after the war, people would continue debating Patton as they always do. Genius or menace, necessary or reckless, visionary or egotist, brutal truth-teller or dangerous performer. The debates never end because Patton himself never fits into one box for long. But in this story, in this exact moment, one thing becomes very clear. He understood that some men do not fear death half as much as they fear exposure. So when the captured SS officer asked for mercy, Patton did not give him the kind that erases. He gave him the kind that preserves his fear, preserves his shame, preserves him long enough to be answered by history. And if you imagine that final image closely enough, you can feel why the room must have gone cold. The prisoner still insisting on categories, the interpreter relaying Patton's contempt, the guards with fixed bayonets, Patton standing there in the center of it all, not screaming now, not needing to, because the decision had already been made. The SS officer would not die in a burst of martyrdom. He would go on as a captive under the weight of everything Patton had just named. For a man who had spent his life inside terror, that may have been the most merciless answer of all. The larger battlefield rolled on. Metz would fall. The Third Army would push east. Winter would come with its frozen roads, the sudden violence of the Bulge, the race to relieve Bastogne, the final drive into Germany. Patton would keep doing what he did best: attack, pivot, exploit, shock, accelerate. But inside that whirlwind, the encounter at Metz remained a miniature of the man. The speed of judgment, the theatrical contempt, the strategic restraint, the instinct to dominate not just the body of the enemy, but the meaning of the encounter itself. That is why the story belongs to Patton and no one else. Another commander might have treated the captured SS leader with icy professionalism. Another might have abused him physically. Another might have hidden behind staff officers and never appeared. Patton turned it into a moral ambush. He let the prisoner walk in thinking this was about military status. Then he made it about character, ideology, and consequences. That was Patton's answer after the request for mercy. Not softness, not sentimental justice, not simple revenge, something more unnerving. He looked at a man who wanted the protections of the world he had helped darken, and he made sure that world would hear the request before deciding what it meant. And in that choice, Patton revealed the deepest truth of his command style. He did not just want to beat enemies. He wanted to overawe them, classify them, expose them, and leave them with no doubt that they had fallen into the hands of a force stronger than their fear and colder than their excuses. So if you strip away the legend, the shouting, the polished helmet, the ivory-handled revolvers, and the myth of old blood and guts, what remains in this story is even more dramatic than the caricature. A captured SS officer asked for mercy. Patton answered by refusing to let mercy become camouflage. He kept the man alive. He kept the pressure on. He kept the truth attached. And in a war full of bullets, fire, and quick deaths, that may have been the most devastating thing he could have done.